So let's look at another component. This is the text field, so this would be a little text box that you can type things into. The class we use for this is JTextField. JTextField can display a single line of text or let the user enter in a single line of text. So this doesn't work for multiple lines, it's a single line only. When you create a JTextField object, you can create it either with some default text, like, enter name here or something like that, or you can create it with a width, which is defined in columns. Now, in theory, a column is like the width of a single character, but it's not really that precise. So you might have to play around a little bit with different widths to get the look you want. Now, the user can enter text that's longer than the one particular JText field. It just won't be visible. I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. Now, for JTextFields, what happens is the event object is actually created when the user clicks enter. So that's what generates the event object behind the scenes. So the user can type as much as they want into the text field, but it's when they click enter, that's when the event object is generated. Now, note, however, that you can retrieve the text from a text field at any time. So you don't have to wait until that event object is generated. You can always get whatever text happens to be there at that moment. Okay? Just like a J button, the listener type of listener that we use for JTextField is action listener, and the method is the same, public void action performed. Now here's some methods that are useful for JTextField. The most useful one is getText. Please note that this returns strings only. So even if the user types in 13, it's going to return to you the string 13. So if you want to get numeric information out of a text field, you have to use the integer.parseInt or double.parseDouble or similar methods to convert from string to int. Okay. There's a setText method, which allows you to change what text is displayed. And then there's isEditable, which evaluates whether or not the current text field is editable, meaning the user can type into it. And then we can also set the text field to be editable, true or false. So this is similar to how we can set a button to be clickable or not. We can also determine and set whether we want a text field to be editable, meaning the user can type into it, or not. Now, the really nice thing about event handling in Java is that once you get the hang of kind of the general approach, the idea of the event sources, the event objects, and the event listeners, all of the different GUI components work the same. So we just saw an example of JButton. We're going to look at an example of JTextField now, but hopefully you'll start to see that it's the same process being used again and again and again. So the nice thing about that is that once you again kind of learn this process, you have access to a whole bunch of components that Java gives you, right? So we've got buttons, fields, sliders, tables, all sorts of different GUI components, and they all work exactly the same way in terms of it's your job to create the component, then you register it with a listener, and behind the scenes, Java generates that event object. So once you kind of learn the hang of that general approach, you can really work with many different types of graphical components that Java provides. So keep that in mind as we're going through these examples, that the purpose here is to really learn this general approach, and then you can apply it to all sorts of different components. So let's look at an example of JTextField. We're going to again further modify our Hello World program, and we're going to add in a little text field where the user can enter in their name, and when they click the button, the name will be displayed as part of the label. Now we're then going to modify it so that the display is changed either when the button is clicked or when the user enters text into the text field. So I'll show you what I mean when I said before that you can always retrieve that text, or you can actually wait till the user clicks enter. So we'll take a look at both things. Okay, so I'm going to follow that same process that I did for the button. I'm going to first declare my instance data variable. I'll call it name field. Then in my constructor, I'm going to create the name field. So name field object gets a new JText field. And here I could again specify default text. So I'll start with that. And then I'll show you afterwards what it looks like to specify the width instead. Next step is to customize if I want to. I don't think I need to customize anything. I'm just going to use the defaults. Then I have to add it to my panel so that we can actually see it visually. Now here I have to decide if I want to register a listener or not. So again, there's two different ways I can go about this with text fields. You can either rely on some other method to trigger when you want to get the text, like the clicking of a button, or you can register a listener directly to the text field, and then that listener will be kicked into gear when the user clicks enter. So it just depends on how you want your program to work. If you had just a single text field and no buttons, you would definitely want to register a listener to that text field. But let's say you had maybe 10 text fields on a page and then a submit button at the bottom of the page. You wouldn't want the user to have to click enter on each one of those text fields. You'd want to wait till they filled them all out, then click the button, and that's when you'd want to retrieve the text. So it makes sense to use different approaches for different programs. It depends what your program is. So I'm going to show you both. We're going to start with the approach where we're not actually listening to the text field at all. We're just going to use the button to trigger the action of retrieving text. Okay, so for this first approach, I'm not going to add a listener to the text field at all. But what I am going to do is down in my button listener, I'm going to comment this other code that we had out. So this is the first round, the first example. Okay, and here's be the second example. Okay. So here, what we're going to do is when the user clicks the button, we're going to retrieve whatever it is that the user has typed into that name field. So I'm going to say the user text is namefield.getText. So again, note that I can always retrieve the text even if I don't have a listener set to that text field. I don't need a listener. I can always pull the text at any moment, in particular, the moment a button is clicked. Okay, so I'll get the user text, and then I'll use that to set the text of the label. So it's going to now be message plus the user text. And I'll leave the button clickable so we can see multiple messages. So now if I run this, this is what my program looks like. So there is my label. There we go. There's my button and there's my text field. Okay. Now here's what we can see that we've got the default text in there, enter name here. If I click into it, it doesn't automatically erase the default text. I have to highlight it and backspace. I can put in my name and then click here, and there we go. Now, do note that things kind of reshuffle a little bit in terms of their layout, in terms of lines. We'll talk about that eventually when we get to layout managers. You can kind of just ignore that for now. Okay, so I can put in my full name. Now here's what I mean about I can type longer than what is shown. The Jessica is still there. It's just kind of you can't see it in the text field. So the width of the visual text field doesn't limit the width of the text the user can type in. It just limits the visual display. So if I do that and click here, I'll now get Hello World Jessica Masters. Okay. So that's how the text field works generally. And again, this is the first approach where we're not putting a listener on the text field itself, but we're using the click of the button to trigger that retrieval of the text. So you'll notice that if I type in something else and click enter, nothing happens. I'm clicking enter here, nothing's happening because the text field doesn't have a listener that's registered to it. So if I want to take action when the user clicks enter, what I would need to do is I'd need to link a listener to my text field. Now in our case, we can actually use, and here let me also add this space here. That was bugging me. We can actually use the same listener because it's the same action that we want to happen whether the user clicks the button or whether they type in text and click enter. Now that won't always be the case, and usually you won't use both approaches. Usually you'll use one or the other, but for this example I'll just show you what I mean. So here I can type in, I can add an action listener, the same one, a button listener, which probably should have a different name now since it's not just listening to the button, it's also listening to the text field. And now when I run my program, oops, got something extra, there we go. When I type Jessica and click enter, so notice I'm not clicking the button, I'm just going to type enter, that also triggers the event. Okay. Now, one thing you'll notice too, because we created our JText field with default text rather than a width, is that the width is kind of changing when we put different input in. So, okay, so you can see that the width is changing. That's a little bit different from if we had instead initialized with a width. That wouldn't happen. So let's start. I'll show you what 10 columns looks like. Looks like that. Pretty good length. And there's no default text in there. Okay, and I can enter in, my really long input this time, click enter, and the width doesn't change. So if you want the width to be fixed at whatever you set it, then I recommend using the constructor version where you send in the number of columns, because then it won't change no matter what the user types in. Now let me show you one other thing where, let's say we do want the user to only be able to do this once. So we want to actually disable both the button and the text field after the action is taken. So to do that, we can just still set the click button enabled to false. That code would be the same. But then we can also take the name field and set editable to also to false. So that means the user will no longer be able to click inside that text field. So that looks like this. So you'll notice now the button here is grayed out. The text field, it still shows up, but it's also grayed out. And here I'm typing into this field and nothing's happening because it's no longer editable. Okay. So that's a little example of retrieving text on the response of a button click, or retrieving text once the user clicks enter. Remember that to do that, if you want to retrieve text once the user clicks enter, you do need to link up a listener to your text field. But oftentimes you won't need to do that. You'll just retrieve the text based on some other action, such as the user clicking a button. So here's a little summary of creating your GUI components. Your first step is to declare them as private instance data variables. That goes outside of any methods, outside of the constructor, but of course inside the class. Then inside your constructor, you initialize that component. You customize it if there's something you want to customize. You add it to your panel. And then only if the user interacts with that component, you register a listener. So not all components will need a listener. For example, your labels will never need a listener. Your text field may or may not need a listener depending on how you want your program to work. So that's kind of some components will have this and some won't. And then the third step, if you do have a listener, you of course need to write that listener class.